alchemist, detective, prophet, and architect of the modern world.
He sent dozens of people to the gallows, spent decades searching for the legendary Philosopher's Stone, and calculated the exact date of the end of the world.
Did you think you knew Isaac Newton from school textbooks? You were wrong.
Isaac Newton wasn't the kindly old man in the picture. He was a master spy who personally interrogated criminals in prison.
An occultist who believed the date of the end of the world was hidden in the Bible, and a man who invented the laws of physics on weekends.
He was the most dangerous and bizarre mind of his time. But to understand how this phenomenon arose, we must go back to the very beginning.
To the dank Lincolnshire village of Woolsthorpe, in the year 1642, when the world around us was falling apart.
Newton's story begins on Christmas Day, 1642, in a world gripped by civil war and fear.
England was torn in two. Parliamentary troops confronted the royalists, and every home in the country lived in anticipation of disaster.
Against this backdrop, in the small village of Woolsthorpe, on December 25, 1642, a child was born that almost no one expected to see alive.
He was born prematurely, so small that, according to legend, he could fit into a quart mug.
The midwives who were sent to a neighboring house for help were in no hurry. They were sure that the baby would already be dead by the time they returned.
But he survived. His father, the illiterate farmer Isaac Newton Sr., died 3 months before his birth, never knowing about him.
Little Isaac spent the first 3 years of his life under the care of his mother, Hannah. Then his world collapsed.
When Isaac was only 3 years old, his mother married a wealthy and elderly priest named Barnabas Smith.
Smith set a condition. He would take Hannah, but not her child. The mother agreed. She moved to her husband's house, leaving her son to be raised by his grandparents. The distance between the two houses was several kilometers, close enough that Isaac could see the smoke from the chimney of the house where his mother lived,
and far enough away that she would never come for him.
This betrayal left a lifelong scar. Years later, as an adult and a renowned scientist, Newton compiled a list of his sins. Among the sins is a clause written with cold hatred. Threatened Smith's father and mother to burn them and the house above them.
Not repentance, not remorse, simply a statement of fact. This is the voice of a man who had no one to complain to, no one to cry on.
He wrote it down as one might write down a debt so as not to forget. Psychologists point out that it was this early trauma that became a formative experience for his personality.
The absence of his father, the feeling of abandonment by his mother, living with relatives who took him in out of duty rather than love, all this gave rise to a deep and incurable loneliness in him.
Newton never had close friends in the true sense of the word. He never entered into romantic relationships. He lived in his inner world with such fullness that the outside world seemed to him only a hindrance. When Barnabas Smith died in 1653, Hannah returned to Woolsthorpe with 3 children from her new marriage.
Isaac was 10 years old. His relationship with his mother had never been mended. Too much had been said and left unsaid.
But she brought with her something priceless, Smith's library, containing several hundred books.
It was there, among dusty tomes on theology and natural philosophy, that Isaac Newton began his real education.
An outcast child found refuge not in people, but in machines. In the quiet of rural England, he built a water clock with astonishing precision.
He created perfect scale models of mills that worked exactly like real ones, only in miniature.
He studied the principles of their design, not from books, but by taking them apart and putting them back together again and again until he understood every detail from the inside. His neighbors said that he once flew kites with lanterns at night so that frightened peasants ran home, thinking they were seeing comets.
At the local grammar school in Grantham, the teacher quickly realized he had something exceptional in front of him. At the local grammar school in Grantham, the teacher quickly realized he had something exceptional in front of him.
He wasn't interested in his classmates' games. He wasn't interested in their conversations. He was preoccupied with his own internal affairs.
When his mother tried to make a farmer out of him, Isaac showed himself so useless that this in itself became an argument.
The uncle who saw this convinced Hannah the boy should be taught and not forced to plow the land.
In 1661, at the age of 18, Isaac Newton entered Trinity College, Cambridge University.
There he was, a subsizer, the lowest rank of students who paid for their education not with money, but with labor.
They cleaned the rooms of wealthy students, served at table, and carried out small errands. It was a humiliation that Newton bore in his characteristic way. He ignored it.
While others enjoyed the high life, drinking in taverns, discussing politics, and hunting, Newton alone absorbed the works of Aristotle, Descartes, and Galileo. Making a note in his notebook, which became his motto, "Plato is my friend, Aristotle is my friend, but my best friend is truth." This notebook, Questiones Quaedam Philosophicae, has survived to this day. Reading it, researchers are amazed. There's nothing student-like about it.
This is not a summary of other people's thoughts, but a dialogue with the great minds of the past, in which the young Newton gains the upper hand every now and then. He challenges Aristotle, where Descartes has already refuted him. He goes beyond Descartes, where he left off.
By the age of 22, Newton was ready for his leap.
In 1665, just as Newton was finishing his bachelor's degree, the Great Plague struck England.
The disease originated in London and spread rapidly across the country. In the capital alone, approximately 100,000 people died that year, almost a quarter of the city's entire population. The university closed. Students and faculty were sent home. Newton returned to Woolsthorpe. For anyone else, this would have been a crisis. For Newton, these were his Annie Mirabiles, wonderful years.
In complete silence, without teachers or prompting, without rivals or audience, he single-handedly made a series of discoveries, each of which in itself would have been enough to enter the history of science.
But they all happened within 18 months.
The first is mathematical calculus, which he called the method of fluxions. The problem was old: how to calculate the rate of change of a variable at a specific point in time. Newton provided a general method. He developed a system of rules that allowed these problems to be solved mechanically, step by step. This was not just a new method, it was a new language of mathematics that would be spoken by all of physics for the next 3 centuries.
The second is optics. In his room, Newton drilled a small hole in the shutter, passed a beam of light through a glass prism, and saw a rainbow on the wall.
No surprise, many had seen it before, but Newton asked a question others hadn't. Where do colors come from?
The prevailing theory held that a prism colors white light. Newton conducted a series of experiments and proved otherwise.
White light is a mixture of all the colors of the rainbow, and a prism does not create them, but separates them.
He took a second prism and reassembled the dispersed colors into a white beam. The proof was impeccable.
Third, and most famous, gravity. The legend of the fallen apple most likely has a basis in reality. Newton himself told it in his old age.
But what's important isn't the apple itself, but the question it raises. If gravity pulls an apple toward the Earth, can it reach all the way to the moon?
What if the moon doesn't fall on Earth only because it moves fast enough and misses it every time?
What if its orbit is a fall, only eternal? Newton performed the calculations. He took the known distance from the Earth to the moon, the known speed of the moon, and the known acceleration of falling bodies near the Earth's surface.
The numbers matched with astonishing precision. The same force controlled the apple's fall and the movement of the celestial body. The universe was designed more simply and beautifully than anyone could have imagined.
But Newton was in no hurry to publish this discovery.
he was not sure of the accuracy of his data on the radius of the Earth.
It took another 20 years before the world learned about it.
His thirst for truth was almost frightening. Newton took nothing for granted. Even what he could simply measure, he wanted to experience for himself.
To understand the nature of vision and the connection between physical pressure on the eye and color perception, he conducted an experiment that still makes any reader of his diaries shudder.
He took a thin needle, a bodkin, and inserted it into his eye socket, between the eyeball and the orbital bone.
Then he began to gently press on the back of his eyeball, watching how his vision changed.
In his diary, he described in detail the colored spots and circles that appeared at different pressures. No anesthesia, no assistant.
Just a man, a needle, and an unwavering will to knowledge. He repeated the experiment several times.
This was the logic of a man who believed that the only reliable source of knowledge is personal experience. Books lie, teachers make mistakes, tradition is blind.
In another series of experiments, he stared at the sun for several days to understand how prolonged exposure to bright light affects vision. After this, he spent several weeks in a dark room, waiting for his eyes to recover.
I risk losing my sight for the sake of understanding the nature of light. Such was the logic of a man for whom knowledge was literally more valuable than life.
When he presented his discoveries in optics to the Royal Society in 1672, the reaction was unexpected.
Robert Hooke, one of the most famous scientists of the time and Newton's main rival, criticized the work.
Hooke didn't reject it entirely, but he pointed out its weaknesses and offered an alternative explanation. For most scientists, this was a normal scientific debate.
For Newton, this was a personal war. Newton brooked no objections. In general, he had difficulty tolerating the presence of others in the intellectual space that he considered his own. He perceived any criticism not as an indication of a possible error, but as an attack on his personality, on his right to know the truth.
He vowed never to publish again, calling himself a slave of philosophy, an expression so bitter that it reads almost like a farewell letter.
Most people taught in school as great scientists are portrayed in textbooks as people of one idea. Newton in school textbooks is the man who discovered gravity. But the real Newton was a far stranger and more controversial figure. He devoted much of his life to alchemy and theology. His secret laboratory at Trinity College operated almost continuously for 20 years. The fires in the furnaces burned for weeks. Newton personally conducted thousands of experiments, recording the results in encrypted notebooks. He studied the works of the alchemists of the past, Geber, Paracelsus, Basil Valentinus, with the same meticulousness with which he studied Galileo and Descartes. By his own calculations, he copied by hand about 100,000 words of alchemical texts. What was he looking for? The official answer was the Philosopher's Stone, capable of turning metals into gold. But Newton was looking for something more. He was convinced that alchemy was an encrypted language in which ancient sages conveyed knowledge about the nature of matter itself. He believed that there was a certain spirit of nature, an active principle that permeates the entire universe and controls its development. Gravity, life, chemical reactions, all of these, he believed, were manifestations of the same mysterious force, the key to which was held by alchemy.
Today, we know that this belief was wrong, but it was not stupid.
Newton lived before chemistry had finally separated from alchemy, before it became clear that the transmutation of metals was impossible under chemical conditions. The line between science and pseudoscience had not yet been drawn, and Newton, the man who, better than anyone else, knew how to distinguish between knowledge and speculation, sincerely believed that alchemy contained real knowledge. In parallel with alchemy, he studied theology, and here his views were even more radical. Newton was a staunch anti-Trinitarian. He did not believe in the divinity of Jesus Christ and considered the concept of the Trinity to be a later distortion of early Christianity.
This was a deadly heresy in 17th century England. Accepting holy orders meant pledging allegiance to the Trinitarian creed.
This suited him as well as he would have suited himself by swearing to a lie.
He deciphered biblical texts with the same mathematical precision with which he calculated the orbits of the planets.
The Book of Daniel, the Apocalypse of John, he analyzed them like ciphers, looking for precise time indications in numbers and symbols.
And he found it. According to his calculations, the world may end no earlier than 2060. He deliberately wrote "not before," like a man who knows that predicting the date of the end of the world is dangerous, but is unable to resist making calculations.
For Newton, science was merely a byproduct of the search for God's purpose.
He believed that God created the universe according to strict mathematical laws, and therefore, to understand these laws is to come closer to understanding God.
He believed that ancient civilizations, the Egyptians, the Chaldeans, the Greeks, possessed secret knowledge of these laws, which was lost or deliberately encrypted.
And he saw himself as the chosen one to restore it, not as a scientist discovering something new, but as a prophet deciphering the old.
Without Edmund Halley, the man after whom the famous comet is named, the world might never have learned of Newton's greatest work.
The story of their meeting in 1684 is the story of how one man, through his persistence and diplomacy, saved for humanity the greatest scientific book of all time.
Halley came to Cambridge with a specific question: what shape should a planet's orbit describe if the force of gravity decreases inversely with the square of the distance?
Newton immediately replied, "An ellipse." "How do you know that?" asked the astonished Halley. "I calculated it," replied Newton.
He added that he couldn't find the paper with his calculations. A few months later, he sent Halley a 9-page treatise, a small masterpiece that became the embryo of the elements.
Halley realized he had something grand in his hands. He began to persuade Newton to write a full book.
He personally edited the manuscript and resolved conflicts with Hooke, who immediately declared that the idea of inverse squares was his.
Halley ended up paying for the publication out of his own pocket because the Royal Society was bankrupt at the time. His funds went towards publishing a monograph on fish.
In 1687, Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica, Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, was published. This book became the foundation of modern science, the 3 laws of motion, and the law of universal gravitation.
Newton showed that the universe is a huge, predictable mechanism that operates according to strict mathematical rules.
He predicted the tides, explained the precession of the Earth's axis, and calculated the orbits of comets. He explained everything at once.
The reaction from the intellectual world was stunning. The philosopher John Locke asked his mathematician friend to explain to him whether Newton's proofs were correct.
He replied, "True." Locke accepted this on faith and became a convinced Newtonian.
Voltaire, after reading the Principia, wrote that Newton was the greatest man who ever lived on Earth.
European scientists were divided between those who accepted Newton's system and those who challenged it, but no one could ignore it.
Newton himself, however, was not satisfied. Something else troubled him. He did not understand the nature of gravity. He described how it worked with astonishing precision, but he couldn't explain what it was. How does a body at a distance influence another body?
"I do not make hypotheses," he wrote in the preface, meaning, I describe facts without explaining their nature.
This honesty in the face of his own ignorance is one of the most striking features of his genius.
After the publication of the Principia, Newton's life changed dramatically. In 1693, he suffered something like a nervous breakdown.
For several months, he hardly slept, writing incoherent letters to his acquaintances, in which he accused them of conspiring against him.
The causes have not yet been precisely established. Some historians speak of chronic mercury poisoning, others of accumulated psychological exhaustion. After recovering, Newton made an unexpected choice. He left Cambridge and moved to London.
In 1696, he received the position of Warden of the Mint. At first glance, it seemed like a sinecure, a well-paid position that required no actual work.
Most of Newton's predecessors perceived it precisely this way. Newton perceived it differently.
England was drowning in counterfeit coins. By some estimates, up to 10% of all coins in circulation were counterfeit or clipped.
This destroyed the economy, undermined trade, and led to a gradual devaluation of the national currency.
The government announced a large-scale reminting of coins, replacing all old coins with new ones, with a protective rim around the edge.
Newton led this process with an energy and method that amazed everyone around him.
But recoining the coins was only part of the task. Counterfeiters also had to be caught. And here, Newton transformed into something completely unexpected, a detective.
He personally toured London prisons and taverns in other people's clothes, listened to informers, and created networks of informers.
He studied samples of counterfeit coins the way a scientist studies an unknown substance, patiently and methodically.
He collected cases for years, waiting for a sufficient evidence base.
His main opponent was William Challoner, one of the most intelligent and daring criminals of his time.
Challoner didn't just mint counterfeit coins, he even managed to testify in Parliament, accusing the mint officials themselves of poor performance.
And he almost got the contract for the new coins. This was a man who had the audacity to fight the system from within.
Newton hunted him for 5 years. He eventually collected evidence from 24 witnesses and personally interrogated Challoner in the Tower. And he secured the death sentence. In March 1699, William Challoner was hanged at Tyburn. In total, during his years at the Mint, Newton secured the conviction of approximately 28 counterfeiters. Most of them were hanged.
This was the same Newton who formulated the laws of nature and searched for the Philosopher's's Stone. Only now he applied his methods to the criminal world.
With the same cold consistency and the same complete lack of sentimentality. In 1703, Robert Hooke, Newton's longtime enemy and rival, died. And in the same year, Newton was elected president of the Royal Society, the main scientific institution in England.
A coincidence? Or was Newton simply waiting for his chief rival to die before assuming the throne? As president of the Royal Society, Newton ruled with absolute power and equally absolute partiality.
He decided which papers would be published in Philosophical Transactions. He determined who would receive grants and who would not. And the first thing he did was to ensure that the only portrait of Hooke disappeared from all the Society's premises. Today, we do not know what Robert Hooke looked like. Not a single reliable image of him has survived. At the same time, another war unfolded for priority in the discovery of mathematical calculus. The German mathematician Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz developed his version of calculus independently of Newton and published it earlier.
This created a conflict that plagued European mathematics for decades. Who was first? Whose system was superior?
Newton, using his position as president of the Royal Society, secured an official investigation.
The commission created to examine the matter found in Newton's favor. It later emerged that he had written most of its report himself.
Today, historians of science believe that both Newton and Leibniz discovered calculus independently at about the same time. Leibniz's notation system turned out to be more convenient and is what we use today. But in the 18th century, British mathematicians, following Newton, rejected Leibniz's system out of patriotism and personal devotion to their idol. As a result, we fell half a century behind European mathematics.
In 1705, Queen Anne knighted Newton, the first scientist in British history to receive this honor.
Sir Isaac Newton became a living symbol of the triumph of reason. His name was known throughout Europe. His portrait hung in scientists' offices alongside those of Descartes and Galileo.
He became more than just a great man. He became a symbol, an icon.
The embodiment of the very idea of scientific progress.
Modern researchers who studied the surviving strands of Newton's hair found them to contain extremely high levels of mercury, 40 times higher than normal. This is almost certainly the result of many years of alchemical work. Mercury was one of the main substances he worked with.
Often heating it, inhaling the vapors, touching it with your hands.
The symptoms of chronic mercury poisoning are well known to medicine: memory and concentration problems, mood swings, irritability, paranoid states, insomnia, tremors. If you look at Newton's medical history in the last decades of his life, all of this is present: his suspicion of his colleagues, his outbursts of rage, his nervous breakdown of 1693, his increasingly paranoid behavior in disputes with Leibniz and others. But here's the paradox. It was precisely during these years that Newton remained intellectually productive. He published the second and third editions of the Principles, which were substantially supplemented.
He completed work on optics, his second great book, written in an accessible style and an immediate bestseller.
He continued to work at the Mint, continued to manage the Royal Society, and continued to correspond with scientists throughout Europe. The poisoning destroyed his personality faster than his mind. In the last years of his life, he became increasingly reclusive. His niece, Catherine Barton, who lived with him as housekeeper, was one of the few people for whom he felt anything like tenderness. His social circle narrowed to a few students and a few colleagues whom he was still willing to tolerate. From the window of his house on Jermyn Street, he watched the street life of London with the same detached curiosity with which he had watched the movement of a pendulum in his youth. Isaac Newton died on March 20th, 1727, at the age of 84, an incredible age for a man of his time. According to eyewitnesses, he experienced severe pain in his last weeks, but retained a clear mind almost until the end. He refused communion, either because he considered himself unworthy, or because, being a closet anti-Trinitarian, he could not pronounce the necessary words without an inner lie. He was buried in Westminster Abbey, the final resting place of England's kings and national heroes. Peers of the kingdom attended his funeral. Voltaire, who arrived in London shortly after, was astonished that England was burying a scientist with royal honors. But Newton's true legacy lies not in a state funeral or the laws of physics. It lies in his demonstration that the universe is knowable. That the chaos in which people live, disease, war, injustice, death, exists against the backdrop of absolute eternal order. That this order is described by mathematical formulas that can be written on a piece of paper. That the human mind is capable of comprehending this order. This discovery changed everything. It gave birth to the Enlightenment, a movement of thought that placed reason above revelation, observation above tradition, experiment above authority. Newtonian mechanics gave rise to thermodynamics, electromagnetism, the theory of relativity, and quantum mechanics. Every new theory either relied on Newton or overcame him, but could never ignore him. The Industrial Revolution, the technological civilization we live in, is all a direct consequence of one man spending 18 months in a country house in Woolsthorpe during the plague. Newton's paradox is that the man who created the most powerful tool for rational understanding of the world himself lived in a world that would seem irrational to most. Alchemy, biblical prophecies, the secret knowledge of the ancients, all this was not a deviation from his real activity, but an integral part of it. Historian Richard Westfall, who wrote the most comprehensive biography of Newton, spent 20 years studying his manuscripts. In the end, he admitted that the more he learned about his hero, the less he understood him. Newton didn't fit into any category.
He wasn't a scientist who'd discovered an interest in mysticism along the way, nor was he a mystic who'd made scientific discoveries by accident. He was something else entirely.
A being who thought about all of this at once, on some level inaccessible to ordinary minds.
What motivated him? Newton himself answered this question shortly before his death. I don't know what I appear to the world, but to myself I seem like a boy playing on the seashore,
Rejoicing in the fact that from time to time I find a smoother pebble or a more beautiful shell, while the great ocean of truth lies unexplored before me. This phrase is one of the most accurate self-portraits in the history of science. It tells us that Newton retained until the end of his life the ability to see how little you know. His laws weren't a victory over mystery. They were a map of mystery, a description of its contours. Beyond them lay that very great ocean, whose shore he had touched but never entered.
What should we make of this story today? What can we learn from the life of a man who simultaneously invented modern physics and believed in the Philosopher's Stone?
Who personally sent people to the gallows and wrote multi-volume commentaries on the apocalypse? Who was lonely, paranoid, vengeful, and yet discovered the laws by which the entire universe operates?
The first lesson is about the price of knowledge. Newton paid for his understanding of the world with loneliness.
His inability to be intimate, his suspiciousness, his cruelty, all these were not just character traits.
It was a consequence of the way he thought, with such intensity and such completeness that there was simply no room left for anything else.
He didn't refuse human warmth. He didn't notice it. He was so busy with other things.
The second lesson is about the strangeness of genius. If Newton were alive today and you met him at a party, you'd probably find him an unpleasant person.
Withdrawn, prickly, prone to resentment, and unable to listen. His colleagues thought of him in much the same way.
But it was this strange, inconvenient man who changed the way humanity understands the universe.
A genius doesn't have to be pleasant to talk to.
The third lesson is about the power of solitude. The best thing that happened to Newton as a scientist was the plague, which closed the university and sent him home.
In isolation, without social pressure, without the need to live up to other people's expectations, he made discoveries that changed the world.
This doesn't mean we all need to retreat into seclusion, but it is a reminder. Deep thinking requires silence, and silence has become rare.
The fourth lesson is the most important. Newton wasn't afraid of not knowing. His famous, "I make no hypotheses," isn't a refusal to explain. This is a confession. I have described how it works. Why it works this way is unknown to me.
For a man with his ego, with his ruthless confidence in his own superiority, this was an act of incredible intellectual honesty.
He stood before the great ocean of truth and didn't pretend to know what was inside. He simply looked and described what he saw. We analyzed thousands of pages of his personal diaries, archival records of the mint, and his secret alchemical recipes.
To understand, how did a man who believed in magic create the most precise instrument of rationality, modern science?
The answer is both simple and impossible. He made no distinction between these things. For him, the search for the Philosopher's Stone and the search for the law of gravity were one and the same. It was just that one of his tools proved more productive than the other, and the rest he took with him. In diaries written in code, in notebooks he showed no one. Into the great ocean he gazed into until his last day.
This is not just a story about a fallen apple. It is a story about how profound trauma and absolute loneliness can become the fuel for changing reality itself.
I hope you liked it. Please write comments.